Okay, well, as I guess the representative of psychology and cognitive neuroscience on this panel, I just wanted to make a few points about some psychological and cognitive neuroscientific aspects of the self as they relate to memory and the idea that memory is a construction, and touch a little bit on some of the themes regarding narrative that we heard in the previous talk. And I will touch on a little bit. I wasn't sure how much everybody who would be here had read the material, so I'll touch a little bit on what's in the readings and a little bit on what's not in the readings, but some points from our field that I think are relevant to this discussion in this panel. And I'll really just try to make 3 points very briefly. Number one, that the self and memory are closely connected, and talk about a couple of ways in which that has been shown in research in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Make the point, fundamental point, that memory is constructive and not fundamentally reproductive, and then talk a little bit about how understanding number one and number two may be enhanced by appreciating the link between memory and imagination, which I think will feed back nicely into Professor Keen's talk. Okay, first point about self and memory being closely connected. There are a variety of ways in psychology and cognitive neuroscience of memory that self and memory meet. One of them is a very simple effect, experimental effect, known as the self-reference effect, that was initially demonstrated in cognitive and social psychology laboratories, and then was expanded into the domain of cognitive neuroscience with neuroimaging studies. And let me just tell you about one very simple experiment to show this interesting linkage between self and memory. In a typical self-reference effect study, what people would do initially is they would incidentally encode a list of adjectives. Incidental here means that you're a subject in the experiment, but you don't know you're in a memory experiment. I'm showing you a bunch of words, and you're making judgments about those words. The surprise test will come later. So that's what we mean by incidental encoding. So for example, if you're a subject in this experiment, I might show you the word loyal. It could be in uppercase or lowercase, and you have to say, is the word in capital letters? So you would make the judgment yes for that word. For others, you'd make it no. So that's kind of a low level of encoding information that typically will not yield great memory later on. Second thing I might do in this experiment is ask you to make a judgment about whether this word describes a well-known other person. In this case, Albert Einstein. Was Albert Einstein immoral? Most people will say no. People who are typically used in these kinds of experiments might be, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, just people who a lot of people know, and you can make a reasonable judgment about whether this other person possesses the trait in question. And then finally, and this is what we call self-reference, you're asked to make judgments about yourself. Are you honest? And a whole bunch of other trait adjectives come up. So the way we do these experiments, all the different words would appear equally often in all the different conditions, and then after you've had a bunch of these words making judgments about yourself, about Albert Einstein, about whether the word is in capital or small letters, you get a surprise test later on where I'll show you the adjectives and say, was this one of the words I showed you before? And I'll throw in some words that weren't there, some lure items. And here's kind of the interesting effect that turns up in many, many experiments. I'm pulling one from my lab, led by Angela Gutchis a few years ago, but this initial effect was demonstrated some 30 years ago by Rogers and colleagues. The bigger the bar, the better your memory on this recognition test. And what I'm showing you are data from young subjects. Those are university undergraduates and older adults in their 70s, just to show that the basic pattern replicates. And what you see is that you have pretty poor memory in the case condition. That's when you're just making the uppercase, lowercase judgments about the words, both young and old. That's the yellow bar. Memory gets better when you're thinking about whether the word describes Albert Einstein. You later on recognize those words at a much higher level. And best of all, when you're thinking about yourself, relating it to yourself. Now, an interesting question is why that is so. There's a very reliable finding. If you want to get people to remember something really well, just have them think about that something in relation to themselves. Why does this happen? Well, one idea is that maybe this is just a reflection of the principle of depth of processing, which is an idea that's been around many years in cognitive psychology. It goes back to Craik and Lockhart, 1972. We know that one way we remember things well is when we elaborate on incoming information. We make associations, we process it deeply, think about the meaning of information. So maybe what we're seeing here is kind of just thinking about yourself. You have lots of knowledge about yourself. That makes it easier to relate that word you're thinking about to a rich knowledge structure. And maybe that just is what makes your memory better for yourself. So that's a reasonable idea. Well, here's where some interesting work in neuroimaging came along to challenge that idea, or at least put a question mark. We know from functional MRI studies of encoding that there are certain parts of the brain that show more activity when you make a semantic judgment about a word than, let's say, a non-semantic. So it might be thinking about whether a word refers to an abstract or concrete concept, as opposed to thinking about whether the word is in uppercase or lowercase. And we can ask the question when people are in the scanner, what parts of the brain show more activity when you're thinking about the meaning, deep processing, than when you're just thinking about whether it's an upper or lower case. And what I'm showing you there is one of a couple of regions that in many experiments now reliably show increased activity. It's the posterior or back part of the left inferior gyrus, which is a structure on the surface of your frontal lobe, somewhere over in here. That region turns on, activates, more for semantic than non-semantic information. This was a study that came out of my lab. It was led by Anthony Wagner, who's now a professor in the psychology department here a number of years ago, and that's a very robust and reliable finding. Okay, so now you could ask the question. We know that this particular part of the frontal lobe and the other parts of the temporal lobe show increased activity when you think about the meaning of incoming information. So now suppose you do the self-encoding experiment, but you put people on the scanner. Well, if thinking about yourself just is kind of cranking up this semantic processing and you get enhanced memory because you're attaching your encoding to this very rich knowledge structure, you might expect that this region would just show even more activity. But guess what? That's not what happens. That region doesn't increase when you go from thinking about somebody else to thinking about yourself. It's a very different part of the prefrontal cortex. What's labeled here on the slide, the medial prefrontal cortex from that study I showed you. We also did a scanning version of it. That's right in the middle, kind of deep in the frontal lobe. That's the region that shows more activity when you think about yourself compared to thinking about something else. It's not that lateral region that shows more activity. So one thought here is that this medial prefrontal, we don't want to be too oversimplistic in saying, well, that's the self there or anything like that. That's not surely what we mean. But we don't want to go down that road. But what we do see is evidence that there's something really different going on in the brain when you go from semantic to self-encoding. That doesn't seem to be just more semantic encoding or deeper encoding. It looks to be really something different. Now, one thing people in the field argue about is that what is going on, what does the activity in those kinds of regions signify? There's a whole bunch of literature, a little bit outside my domain, that has explored how that activity in that region modulates, for example, when you make different kinds of judgments about yourself, the work of Jason Mitchell and others, and whether that region modulates to some degree when you think about similar versus dissimilar others. So it's a little bit of a piece of the puzzle about self, how it relates to memory, and how it relates to the brain. Number two, the point of memory being constructive, not reproductive. When psychologists talk about memory as a constructive activity, we have to acknowledge the work of Sir Frederick Bartlett, who back in 1932 wrote a great book on remembering. It was really one of the first lengthy works in psychology to make this point, and this is just one of the great quotes from Bartlett. The first notion to get rid of is that memory is primarily or literally reduplicative or reproductive. In a world of constantly changing environment, literal recall is extraordinarily unimportant. Memory appears to be an affair of construction rather than reproduction. He drew that conclusion on the basis of lots of experiments where people read and remembered stories. And it was interesting to me to think about the whole story memory process in light of some of the ideas we just heard about narrative and in Suzanne Keen's talk. I've talked a lot about constructive aspects of memory, the 7 sins of memory. Josh mentioned briefly in the introduction. This is kind of a way of categorizing different ways in which memory can go wrong. The first 3 have to do with different kinds of forgetting, losing information over time, absent-minded forgetting, blocking, retrieval failure. But where things get very much related to the idea of memory as a constructive process is in the next 3, what I call misattribution, suggestibility, and bias. These are different ways in which memory can be prone to error, where a memory is present but it's wrong. Someone believes something about their past but it's not so. And I want to focus in particular on what I call the sin of bias, retrospective distortions produced by current knowledge and beliefs. That's where what we currently know, believe, and feel skews and often distorts what we remember about the past. There are a number of kinds of retrospective biases out there that people have studied, but probably the most interesting relates to the self and narratives about the self and how our approach to the past is shaped by serving the needs of the present self. Now, this is something that was pointed out in one of the readings by Professor Nehemias concerning Nietzsche, who made the simple but trenchant observation that how I see my present self critically affects the very nature of my past. And he would love a lot of the work on retrospective bias that has emerged in psychology over the last 25 years, because it illustrates this point very nicely in different ways. And this idea that we use our present self to kind of reconstruct narratives of the past that make the present self look good was also embraced by Arthur Koestler way back in 1952 in his autobiography about the early part of his life, where we are not only disloyal to others but also to our own past. The gauche adolescent, the foolish young man that one has been, appears grotesque in retrospect and so detached from one's own identity that one automatically treats him with an amused derision. It's a callous betrayal, yet one cannot help being a traitor to one's own past. And consistent with Nietzsche and Koestler, there's a bunch of experimental work that has shown sort of how this comes into being. I'll just give one of potentially many examples. This is not work from my lab, but from work of Ann Wilson and Michael Ross, a couple of social psychologists, who asked people to provide statements about themselves, either their present self, the way you are now, and these were college students, or way back when you were 16. Think back to then. And people have a pretty positive view of their present self. There are many more positive statements than negative statements, but they have a much more negative view of themselves a few years ago. And one idea is that this is evidence for the present self kind of disparaging the past self in a way consistent with what Koestler suggests. Oh, I was lost then, but I'm wonderful now. On the other hand, 16-year-olds do have their issues, so maybe people just do get better over time, and this is accurate, and there's no memory construction or bias going on. So they went a little further with this, and what they found is that if you ask 50-year-olds to rate their current self and then compare it to how they were in the 35 and 20. Now the 20-year-old that was so great in that other study, looking back on the 16-year-old, that's sort of a loser as well now. And the 16-year-old, of course, is even worse. 35-year-old is almost as good as the 50-year-old. Well, you still say, well, okay, well, maybe we just get continually better over time. We're just getting better and better. Well, they did one more experiment that relates to this, where they asked now 70-year-olds to think back on their own lives and provide statements about how positive and negative about themselves and typical others. And so this is the proportion of positive statements. So when you get to 70, you think maybe I was a little bit better at 50, but you still think you were pretty bad when you were back at 20. Here's the critical data point. You don't think that applies to other people in these studies. So they're awful now. I'm doing very well. So you put that whole package of data together, and it really looks like something along the lines of what Kessler and others have talked about. We're using our present self to kind of twist the past, make ourselves look good now. We're better than we were then. Okay, final point. That understanding these first 2 points, I think, can be enhanced by appreciating the link between memory and imagination. Something we've been working on a lot in our lab lately, and I talked about at some length in one of the readings. We and others recently have been doing a bunch of work where we've been looking at cognitive and brain activity when people remember past experiences that really happened to them and when they imagine future events that might happen to them. Something you might do next week. And we've studied this in a variety of ways, behaviorally, looking at various patient populations. And one of the things that has come out very strongly is that there are a lot of commonalities between remembering the past and imagining the future. For example, certain patient populations, amnesic patients who have great difficulty remembering the past, many of them also have problems just imagining what might happen tomorrow. As we get older, we tend to remember the past in a little less detail. Well, that also shows up when we imagine what might happen in the future. There's less detail and specificity. Another way that this point has been made is by fMRI studies. So in what I'm calling here the remembering the past, imagining the future fMRI paradigm, we put someone in a scanner, they're given a cue, and they're asked to either remember an event that occurred in the past. So in this case, the person is remembering walking on the beach in response to the cue word vacation. They're in the scanner, they're remembering this event in as much detail as they can, or they're cued to imagine something that might happen next week or next year. This person in the example is imagining picking out a puppy at the pet store in response to the cue word dog. And what happens then is that there is a striking overlap in the brain when you look at what's going on when people are remembering the past, that's the left panel, versus imagining the future. These are the two main regions here showing up are again deep in the middle of the brain. The activation, the colored pattern on the left is kind of the region of the brain called retrosplenial cortex, posterior cingulate, part of the medial parietal lobe. And then the big blob on the front is that medial prefrontal cortex region that we talked about earlier that activates when you're thinking about yourself. Well, here it shows activation when you're remembering your own past, imagining your own future, compared to various control conditions where you're thinking about meaningful information, even conjuring up vivid images, but not projecting yourself into the past and into the future. And those two regions are part of a broader network, referred to here as a core network that's involved in remembering past events, imagining events, future events, and engaging in related kinds of mental simulations. And this is a network that we'll hear more about tomorrow that really is pretty much coextensive with what's known as the default network. This is a bunch of brain regions that tend to become active when you're just kind of sitting and doing nothing. and they're probably becoming active because when you're sitting and doing nothing, the mind isn't turned off, but rather you're remembering your past and imagining your future. Now, a very interesting question here is to what extent this activity in these brain regions that we see during remembering the past and imagining the future extends into the kinds of narrative activities that we just heard about in Suzanne Keen's talk. When readers, for example, are projecting themselves into a fictional world, they may not be imagining their personal future or remembering their personal past, but surely they're drawing on a lot of the same processes. That's a question we've recently actually gotten very interested in our lab, and we have some experiments, scanning and otherwise, where we're hoping to look at that. But I think that's a very interesting point of contact between what we're doing in the laboratory and some of these issues in narratives that we could talk about further. And for any of you who are just so fascinated by this, you just have to get caught up on the latest on remembering the past and imagining the future. A bunch of colleagues and I wrote a review that just came out in the journal Neuron that would bring you up to speed on all this. Relating this back to constructive memory, my colleague Donna Addis and I put something forth called the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis, basically restating some of what I said, that remembering past events and imagining future events draw on similar kinds of information in episodic memory. They involve a number of shared processes. And we think this is important to thinking about the function of memory, because our idea is kind of that memory is there to help us use our past to simulate different ways in which the future might play out. And our memory is very good at doing that, at allowing us to draw on past experiences in a flexible way to imagine the future. We think that's one reasonable interpretation of some of that overlapping brain activity that you saw. But we think it also is one of the things that makes memory prone to error, which in turn has lots of implications for thinking, for our understanding of ourselves. So bringing it back to the self again, the self is critically involved in both remembering the past and imagining the future. There's the strong influence on encoding and retrieval that we saw, and of course it's the self or something conceptually related to the self, executive processing, psychologists often refer to, that sets goals, that serve to direct and organize simulations of possible future events. And relation to narrative, I talked on that a little bit earlier, in that both remembering and imagining typically take the form of a narrative. So as we heard in the previous talk, there's understanding of narrative form is going to be critical to developing accounts both of remembering the past and imagining the future. And I will conclude with a nod to Nietzsche, who anticipated a lot of this stuff, as pointed out in the reading, when he noted that the significance and nature of the past, that like the significance of everything else, according to Nietzsche, lies in its relationships. In particular, the significance of the past lies in its relationship to the future